Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the session. We had missed out one of the sessions on design protection, and we have the session scheduled for today. We have with us Ms. Sheetal Shrikant, and Ms. Sheetal has been our instructor. She's been an advocate. She is an advocate and specializes in IPR, and she has been with us as an instructor through this AIPR program. So I will leave the floor open to Sheetal. Sheetal, please go ahead with the session.
Thank you so much. So let's get started. So we're going to talk about designs today. So I'll just start off with a question just to kind of understand where we're all at. Can anyone tell me what you understand by design? Just the English meaning of it would suffice. Or let me help you out a little bit. When I say design of bag or design of clothes, what do you gain from that?
Yeah, that can be any design means any type of design new which is innovated,
Correct. Innovative.
new design.
Yeah, but what is the design uh, itself?
It
I
could
mean,
be any engineering designs. It can be any innovations for the new concept of anything, any design.
Yeah, so design maybe in the form of some shape or something and it may be a product, basically to give a better look for a product or something.
right.
It's where we might want to spend some time
Right.
giving it a good shape or a good color or something of that sort.
Exactly. So something that someone does to a product which attracts the eyes first, right? Which grabs your attention really. So these designs are very important in the market today because when you pick any product, anything at all, then you will always have options because we're operating in a mainly capitalistic, choice-oriented market, right? Where we're trying to give consumers as much choice as possible. So everything that you possibly see around you has design. So clothing has design, furniture has design, other things, electronics that you use in your house have designs. Even the apps that you use are based on design, right? So if you're ordering food, you can probably use Swiggy or Zomato or Uber Eats, or if you're ordering groceries, you can use Blinkit or Zepto or again Swiggy, Instamart, or Big Basket, any number of these apps. So all of them are, although while they're functioning the same way, they can all look the same as well, right? But they don't because there is an entire team behind designing all of these things to ensure that your user experience keeps getting better and better um, every day.
Like
So,
like
right.
like this. Just interrupt. Like the design means that what it is a front end type. Suppose if in case software, the front end is means it is going to be only the physical which is to be appeared into the front sides, and
Exactly.
back end means
Exactly.
what is the engineering design is there inside that coding, etc.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So that's a very good catch also, which is something I was just
Yeah.
going to address. Good job, Deepak. So basically, design can be both at the perceptive, like the visual perceptive level, and behind it, right? So even if there's a spare part for your car, it has to be
Mhm.
functionally adaptable to the rest of the parts of the car. Now, not every
Mhm.
part of the car is visible to your eye. Same thing with an electronic gadget. Let's say you have a
Mhm.
semiconductor chip. You don't really see it, right? There is a motherboard. There's other hardware parts inside of your laptop which you're not able to see.
Correct.
Even those parts have design, right? But the
Yeah.
law, which is very interesting, that Deepak pointed out already, the law distinguishes between what is visually perceptive design and what is design otherwise. So basically, something that is aesthetic and ornamental and appeals to the eye, which in Deepak's words is a front end design, is what the law tries to protect. So that's mostly what we'll be talking about today. And through the session, we'll also try to distinguish between what it is that makes ornamental features protectable, while what in the law says that non-ornamental or back end things cannot be protected, right? So, on
Okay.
the basic level, design is basically an ornamental or aesthetic aspect of any product. Now, it includes both 2D and 3D aspects. So if there is a print on a piece of fabric, that is a 2D feature, and a three-dimensional feature would be the shape of a bottle or the shape of a teapot or the shape of, your the coffee cups that you get in Starbucks or any of these places. So it can be any of these things. So it's a combination of shape and configurations, patterns, lines, which all put together are normally referred to as the design. Okay, so now before we jump into the law itself and just start tackling the legal definition of design, I just wanted to sort of come at this from a designer's perspective, right? So throughout the world, for the last about 300 years, there has been a movement in the arts, like specifically decorative arts, where uh, there are two groups of people thinking about this problem, right? One is artists who are into making ornamental things in general, like jewelry designers or clothes designers, right? These are all artists in general, but they're also making products that are mass produced. And there is a second group of people called who call themselves designers, like Don Norman. It's part of one of the reading recommendations for this session. There's a entire book on design about how, which will give you a glimpse of how designers themselves really think about design. And essentially, what I'm trying to say is that there are two groups of people that are thinking about design, and I wanted to sort of explain what designing means to them, so that we are more equipped to understand what the law ought to protect, really, right? So, at any point, if you're not able to understand me, please stop me and ask. Which is always the case, right? So I was telling you about artists, right? Like, so let's say there is Coco Chanel who came up with the brand Chanel, right? Now, Coco Chanel is into manufacturing clothes and stuff, as a clothes designer. Now, Coco Chanel's design of a let's say like a tweed suit or a plaid skirt, any of these are um, protected in law as a design. So how does that design really come about? So what does the designer do? They use either a software or basic pen and paper, and they draw out the visual representation or the idea that they have, right? So the first level of fixation is on paper. They make a copy on any medium like paper or the software of what they want this product to look like, right? And then they make a sample of a product, which means what, they're playing around with material, right? So they use different kinds of fabrics, different colors and different sizes and all of this to sort of craft the first prototype of a product, right? The third step is then they optimize the manufacturing process. But prior to this, what designers do is they first showcase their product in public, right? This is what fashion shows are all about. Like, someone wears what they've designed and they do a ramp walk, and then peers in their field will look at what they've made and they sort of get feedback on their work. And finally, whatever can be put on a shelf in, any of your retail stores, they pick out those designs and they find a way to optimize the manufacturing process. Why should they optimize the manufacturing process? Because Chanel can't sit and make one by one suits and sell it all across the world, right? They can only make 50 or 100 at a time. But they want to make thousands, so they sort of figure out what material works to optimize the further the manufacturing process. And and then they mass produce the product, and then it finally comes into shops like Lifestyle or Westside or Shop Stop, which is where all of you will be buying your clothes from, or it gets retailed online through Myntra or Flipkart or Amazon, right? So that is one way of looking at design. So the first example that I gave you is, that the public requires a particular product, and that the public also requires choice, and you make a business out of it, right? So design basically increases essentially the number of choices that you have for a thing, right? Now, the other way to look at design, which is largely what these design thinkers, the second group of people, are doing, is looking at design as a social and structural problem solving method. So, what they do is first identify where a problem exists, and then they try to solve it. So, for instance, let's take any social issue. For example, like accessibility, right? Now, every motor vehicle, like every form of public transport, has to be accessible to all kinds of people. So, one of the problem is if you're a wheelchair user, how will you get onto a bus? That is a structural social problem, right? Now, how do you solve that? So, obviously, there are different design solutions to that. You can make a ramp which will allow you to get onto the bus more easily, or you can make a bus stop which is at the same level as the first step of the bus, and sort of making it possible to seamlessly enter the bus from the bus stop. So there are a number of solutions that you can come up with. So on the right side of the slide, the image that you see is this is the design thinking model that Don Norman came up with recently, where he's explained the 6 steps of how you make a design, right? Now, why I'm getting into all of this is basically to tell you what design thinking really requires. Because in most cases, whether it is copyright or patent or trademark, we can sort of capture what the creative good is that the law tries to protect very easily. Because in copyright, I just have to say that someone made a piece of music or someone wrote a book, and it immediately occurs to you what is being protected in law, right? Even for patents, it's very easy for me to just say someone invented the light bulb, and you can immediately capture what it is that patent law is trying to protect. Similarly with trademarks, trademark law protects trademarks. It's a very easy, one step approach to figuring out what the law requires to protect. But in design, what happens is design operates on so many levels. Design operates on a problem solving level. Design operates at like a capitalistic level. Design operates at a market level. So it has so many levels at which it operates. So what exactly among all of these levels does the law really protect? Because I can tell you right now that the law doesn't protect all design efforts, right? Design law only applies to certain specific things. So what we discussed so far is to sort of give you a glimpse of what designing altogether requires in terms of human effort. So from this process, you have several offshoots, right? You have informational design, you have legal design, you have product design, right? And not all of this is protected in law. However, I just wanted to capture what all design can really resolve. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit into the history of design protection. Hold on, please, one second. Sorry, I needed a small break. My eye is hurting. Okay, so design history, right? So, like I explained with copyright and patent and trademark in our very first session, all intellectual property developed in silos. They have their own histories. Copyright came about for a different reason. Patent came about for a different reason. Trademarks came about for a different reason. But I didn't address design's history that day. We'll come to that today, right? So essentially in the 1800s, designing simply meant adding ornamental features to products of everyday use. That's it. It was very simple at that time, right? So one thing that they wanted to extend legal protection for was to sort of protect these ornamentations by rewarding the labor that went into it, right? Somebody is actually applying their mind and figuring out how a product should look for it to look better. So they just extended sort of some rudimentary structure of copyright law, whatever existed back then, right? They extended this copyright protection to design as well. So just like copyright used to be protected for a certain length of time, which started with, let's say, 14 years under the Statute of Anne, like we discussed the other day. Um, this These designs were also protected under the same regime back then, right? And the second important thing is design. You have to always remember, to really understand where this is coming from, you have to always remember that design was always trying to, design law specifically, was always trying to resolve a market problem, right? What is the market problem that it was trying to resolve? Basically, if one design is protected as being proprietary to a particular person, it makes counterfeiting impossible, right? This is exactly what we discussed in trademarks as well. That if I come up with a shape of, soap, and I call it Sheetal's soap, you will sort of associate that shape of the soap only to me. That way, counterfeiting becomes impossible. No one else can sell soap under that name with that shape, because it's normally become identifiable to the public that that soap has a certain source of identity. So these are the two things that design law began trying to uh, address. But then eventually, in the 1900s, we hit a snag of sorts. What happened was, a lot of people designing useful articles started claiming design protection. And that became a problem. Let me explain how. Okay. So, one person, actually, this is a case law, but I won't explain it like a case law because it's going to be really dry and boring. So I'm going to tell it you like a story, right? So one person came up with a design for a muffler. Do you know what a muffler is? As a automobile part, you know what a muffler is, right? So what he came up with is a design of a muffler, and he tried to enforce design protection for this muffler, right? And finally, uh, what I mean, through the court cases surrounding this sort of extension of design protection to these kind of spare parts, what problem really arose was that anything, what eventually came to be understood is that anything, whether it is front end or back end, the way Deepak said it, uh, was falling within the confines of design law, which meant that if it became proprietary, no one else can manufacture spare parts. So if you have a Jaguar like tap in your bathroom and something happens to it, if there is protection extending to the way the screw or the nut or the bolt in it even works, it means that no one can manufacture that kind of threading. If that kind of threading is itself taken out of the market, then what happens? Only one person can manufacture it. So if something happens with the tap in your bathroom, you have to run back to Jaguar and buy it from the same manufacturer every time. That happened with car spare parts also, right? So not every aspect of design should be protected like that, because that means only one person will have monopoly over protecting it. That's when we made this entire legal like gulf or separation between aesthetic aspects of a design and functional aspects of design, right? So the functional aspects of a design basically meant that if there was a part of a design that makes something function the way it does, it cannot be protected by design law. What design law will protect is only the aesthetic, ornamental, or the appealable or the artistic features of a design, right? Which means if you have an automobile spare part that is not even visible to the eye, is hiding somewhere, and is just designed that way for it to be able to function properly, that cannot be protected under design law, right? So that's one. So what happened was, we eventually realized that if you start protecting everything that is functional, then only one person will have monopoly over it, which we cannot have happen. Okay. I'll give you an example. You guys know what a sleeve is, right? A sleeve for a coffee cup that you get in Starbucks or whatever. It's that round thing made out of corrugated paper where if you hold on to that. The heat, it's a heat insulator basically. It won't let the heat of the coffee touch your hands. Now, let's say if Starbucks came up with the idea of the sleeve and put it on the coffee cup and exercise design protection over any shape or form of that sleeve. It means that no other coffee manufacturer can ever use a sleeve, which means what everyone will give you hot scalding coffee and then you just burn your hands. That can't be the solution to the problem. So what they made, what design law did was make design protection similar to that of copyright, which means if you come up with a specific design for something, only that design, the way it exactly looks, the way you made it, is protected. And the functional aspects of that sleeve are kept out of the scope of protection, which means anybody in the market is free to manufacture a coffee sleeve, except Starbucks can only use the design that is proprietary to itself. Is that making sense to everyone? Okay. Any questions, Deepa?
No, correct. Means protection design it may be in the form of symbol or in the name of an organization. Suppose for Olympic symbol there is a 5 rings of different colors.
Yeah.
So that cannot be copied or can be used for something else.
Yeah. But that is what you're referring to as a symbol or a mark, right? So that's more akin to trademarks. What we are addressing here is like the design of a product, like the shape of the Coca-Cola bottle, for instance. That's it.
Coca-Cola Thumbs Up, yes,
Yeah,
correct.
the moment you see that shape of the bottle, you can only associate it with Coca-Cola, right? Or the shape of like a Dove soap bar, or the shape of a shampoo bottle, or the colors on any detergent packet. All of those are designs. Basically, essentially, the way a product looks to your eyes.
Okay.
More than
Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the sleeve of the coffee mug, coffee cups, right? That we get usually in Starbucks or Chai Point.
Right.
This is something which also has a functional aspect to it. That is basically, you should be able to catch a hot piping coffee.
Yeah.
Much difficulty. So where do we draw this line between something which is also doing a functioning and as well, or something which has a utility, plus it has a nice design also. It looks trendy.
Right, exactly. So how we draw the line is by showing the exact representation of the design that we're trying to protect. So let me give you an example. So I'll give you the sleeve example itself. So if I come up with a coffee sleeve for, like, okay, Christmas is around the corner now, right? So if I make a coffee sleeve sort of as in the shape of Christmas trees that are kind of welded together, and I come up with a coffee sleeve in that shape for this season, I can protect that. But my protection in design law will extend only to that literal representation of it, which is Christmas trees melded together, which I've made look like a coffee sleeve, but doesn't extend to coffee sleeves in general. So if anybody else is free to use the same material of corrugated paper or the same idea and come up with any other design, which we today call design, is only that 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional visual representation of something and does not extend itself to the functional aspects of it, which means you're free to use the material, you're even free to use the idea of putting something around the coffee cup, essentially. But that's a very important question, actually. So what you would limit yourself to is the exact visual representation, which is where I'm saying the similarity in the 1900s, when we figured out this functionality problem in design law, designs started sort of overlapping with copyright law, because it's exactly what copyright does, right? We've discussed this, which is that it protects something that is fixed in a tangible medium in the form that it was fixed, and doesn't protect anything more. It's a very thin layer of protection, so to speak, which is kind of what design does as well. And then there's another arbitrary thing that design laws also did, which my entire LLM thesis was on this one line, the last line on this slide, actually. I wrote like 100 pages on this, but I'll just limit myself to like 4 lines for the purpose of this session. It is that basically when design laws became a separate law, separate body of law protecting designs, Britain and Canada and the US, all of them wrote different statutes to protect designs separately, right? What we call a sui generis design law. So when that came up, they created an exception. Basically, if there is a visual representation of something, if you draw something on a piece of paper, it already has copyright protection, right? But if you apply that to a useful product, so let's say I draw a picture of a Christmas tree. My Christmas tree will have copyright protection for my life plus 60 years under copyright law. Now, if I take that Christmas tree and apply it to a useful article like the coffee sleeve that I was explaining just now, then the moment I mass produce it, mass production is they've drawn an arbitrary line. If I manufacture more than 50 copies of the same thing, 50 sleeves essentially, my drawing loses copyright protection. It can only be protected under design law. So the moment you come up with basically what they did was, if you're intending to use something as a design, the moment you come up with it, they forced you to go and register it as a design so that you don't lose design protection, because designs have to be registered, unlike copyright. At the same time, you can't have a lengthy protection for it, like in copyright law, which is lifetime plus 60 years, because you're going to mass produce and make money out of it, right? So they give you a limited monopoly for 25 years, beyond which that design will enter the public domain. So, for instance, toys that Mattel and all of these Fun School and all of these companies came up with in the 90s will now be in the public domain, because design protection in most countries lasts for 25 years. So one other thing that I wanted to address is also parallelly along with this whole functionality debate and talking about spare parts and mufflers and all of that. What happened in Britain was also there was a very aggressively growing arts and crafts movement, which is a lot of designers came together and try to revive the field of decorative arts. The image that you see on the left, which is also available on Wikipedia, is one of the wallpaper designs that came out of the arts and crafts movement in Britain in the 1900s. So these kind of decorative pieces. So what you see there is a good example of a design, right? It's a 2D unique design for a wallpaper, and it's very visually stunning and it looks like, even apparently looks like it involves a lot of craftsmanship, right? Where they've drawn that there's a bird there on the left, and then there are the branches of the tree are going through like panes of windows or glass or whatever, and each of them is distinguished by color, right? It's a very visually stunning piece of art. Anyway, so this is exactly what design laws were meant to protect. So a lot of lobbying from the participants of this arts and crafts movement also led to the growth of a separate design law protecting designers, giving them hefty monopoly for a period of time, which is now 25 years, under a separate law. They pushed for this to happen because they realized that in copyright, if someone comes up with a similar design, copyright law is not in all situations equipped to stop it, right? Because we've discussed this. There are defenses like independent creation and all of that that people can use to shield themselves from monopolistic litigation. But in designs, what design law essentially does is give protection like patent law does, which is giving you a monopoly over something, but for something that is subject to copyright protection. It's somewhere in the middle of copyright and patent law. And while the monopoly doesn't last very long, like in copyright law, like in patent law, it's a very strong monopoly. You can actually stop someone from copying it. So I'll just end this whole functionality aesthetic debates with this last case law. This is the case law on which the assignment for this session will also be based. After this, we'll move on to the actual legal aspects of design itself. So this is a case that happened in 2011, a decision of the United Kingdom Supreme Court, which basically had to look into how to protect what you see on the right in the image, which is a stormtrooper helmet. Has anyone watched Star Wars here? Yeah.
Mhm.
So in Star Wars, you have Darth Vader and his army of men, right? They're all dressed using this stormtrooper helmet that you see on the right. Okay. Now, essentially, what the producers of the film did was they tried to extend protection in intellectual property law to this stormtrooper helmet. And what essentially happened at the end of this case was there's little tussle in this case on copyright and design specifically, but it's a good case law to understand functionality. And to understand what design law really protects, you have to be able to understand functionality, because once you are able to separate functionality in your head from aspects of ornamentation and aesthetics, your half the battle is won. So when a client comes to you for with a design and says, hey, can I register this? Can we make an application? The first thing you have to do is to be able to discern the functional aspects and sort of separate them from the artistic aspects, so that you can advise your client properly on what actually is profitable. Because what we've discussed so far is that a design includes so many things, and not all of those things are protected in law, right? So this is a seminal case which will help you separate functionality from everything else. Anyway, but the court was not so successful. Actually, in my opinion, the court was wrong in this case. But let me just tell you a little bit about it. So, what the producers did was they said that, this stormtrooper helmet is unique. It's a design that we came up with for the purpose of the film. It's an artistic product, and it deserves to be protected in intellectual property law as such, right? And um, they also tangentially said that for the purposes of copyright law, the stormtrooper helmet is basically like a structure, like a sculpture, right? So someone would have drawn the helmet, and the visual representation is converted into like a 3D product, right? So they said it's like coming up with an architectural work or a sculpture for the purposes of copyright law. But unfortunately, what happened was the court disagreed with them, and they disagreed with them on what I believe is a completely wrong reason. But anyway, what the court said was that this stormtrooper helmet is functional. And they said it's functional because they said it was only used as a prop in the film and does not by itself constitute an artistic work. And in fact, one of the judges even went to the extent of saying it is a helmet and it was worn on somebody's head, so it was functional. But what do you guys think? Do you think this is a functional helmet? Or do you think it's a piece of art? Can you call this helmet functional? As in, do you think that?
It can be functional as a helmet. I can use it.
Yeah, but would you? I mean, what? Okay, fine. Yes, you can. If I gave you if I gave you this helmet, and if you didn't have another one, I'm sure you can wear it, and it would still serve the same purpose. But it wasn't intended for that, right? In the sense, it wasn't made in the film. It was made to um it was made to dress up
To
a
attract.
stormtrooper. It wasn't,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's attractive today only because it's a stormtrooper helmet, because there's such a huge, like, it's become a cult classic, and there's so much cultural significance associated with a stormtrooper. Like, if you're a Star Wars fan and you've been watching Star Wars for all these years, you'll be so excited to own the helmet, not because it functions as a helmet, but because it's a stormtrooper helmet and it has significance in culture more than it does as a helmet, right?
Okay.
So anyway, but actually the court agreed with Deepak, which is by saying that it's a helmet and it was functional, and you only used it as a prop in the film, so uh, it's not really a work of art. But a lot of commentators disagree on this. So this is where design law gets murky, and this case is a very good example of how it's so difficult to actually separate functionality from aesthetics, because something can be aesthetic and functional, and you really have to get into the mind of the designer and sort of get behind the intent of the product itself. But really, design law doesn't allow for so much thinking. Initially, there were laws which said that anything that is intended to be used as a design applicable to a useful article would become a design. But most laws have gotten rid of this phrase of saying intended to be used, because nobody wants to get into the mind of the designer to figure out something. So they literally look at a thing and decide whether it is actually functional at its core or artistic at its core, right? I'll just stop here for a moment to tell you about the assignment. I don't know how many of you in the class are actually doing the assignment, but Pratima, you can communicate it to them, right? So my initial assignment was to do a design priority search, but I believe that's not very interesting. So I've changed it up a little bit. So basically, I want a case comment written on this judgment. I've shared a copy of the judgment already. A case comment generally has 4 parts. So the first is a brief explanation of the facts of the case in your understanding. The second is draft 1 or 2 questions that are at issue in the case, which is the issues involved in the case. And finally, summarize the judgment. And the last part, in about 5 or 6 sentences, you have to explain your opinion of the judgment, about whether you believe the judgment and the reasoning that is given in it is right or wrong. You'll communicate this, Fatima, to the others. I don't know if everyone.
For this one?
For this case, yes, I've shared the
Okay.
judgment already. It will be shared with
Okay.
you. You have to read the judgment and you have to prepare what I just said, right? Which is a case comment.
Okay.
First, facts, then summarize the issues involved, summarize the judgment, and give us your opinion about what you feel about the judgment in about 4 or 5 lines.
Sure.
Right?
We'll let
Yeah. So because the once you read the judgment, it will really force you to think about functionality, which is honestly, as a lawyer, that's the only thing you need to understand design. The moment you're able to separate that from everything else, the rest of what is left is just procedure. Anybody can read that online and figure out how to do a good design application. But at its core, you have to really truly understand what exactly can be protected in law. That's why I'm giving you this exercise, right? Also, Pratima, when are all the assignments due for all of the first round of
shared the assignments. This will also go out in during this week.
Okay.
Tentatively, about 15 days, I think, is what is given to them
Okay,
for
so
submission of the assignment.
mid-Jan sometime.
That's right. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Okay. Would
It will
anyone?
be sent through mail.
Yes. Please send it through mail. You can send it to us. You can send it to Dr. Anshul if you have her email. Or I can share the email address here on the chat. Please go ahead, Dr. Sheetal, please go ahead. I'll share Dr. Anshul's email address here.
All right. Okay. So now we've finally come to the point. I shouldn't be saying this like 50 minutes into our class, but this is where we were supposed to start. But I mean, I think the previous 3 slides are way more important, actually. So Section 2 of the Designs Act really protects this, what you see on your screen. So we have the Designs Act 2000 in India, which is the only law covering protection of designs. And then you have rules framed under the law, right? And finally, it has all of the history of design development and legal protection has boiled down into one piece of legislation, and it protects what you see on your screen right now. So the first is only features of shape, configuration, pattern, ornament, or composition of lines or colors. So basically, how a product looks is what is ultimately protected. Fine. That you've obviously understood by now. The second is this has to be applied either in a 2D or a 3D form by any industrial process, right? This is where they bring in the element of mass production. So if you connect this back to the history of design, where we were only trying to attack counterfeiting, you will understand why this has come into the law now. So if something cannot be made cannot be made for the purposes of mass production, There's no point in giving you a monopoly. The whole point of giving you an aggressive monopoly for 10 plus 15 years under the design law is so that you will mass produce the article, sell as many pieces of it as possible, and eventually allow the design to enter the public domain. If it's some exclusive painting or something which cannot be really mass produced, it just stays in its fixed medium and you can make maybe 10 or 20 pieces in your whole lifetime, right? So that's not what we're trying to address. This design law is trying to address something that is ornamental, which would increase choice in the market, which is amenable to mass production, which means there's a lot more of it in the market, which means we have to go back and prevent counterfeiting, right? So that's where this third point is coming in. Industrial process or means where manual, mechanical, or chemical processes are combined to manufacture a finished article whose appeal is judged solely by the eye. So we're not really addressing in this functional aspects, right? Like functionality is removed completely out of the picture here. What we're trying to do is only protect
But
what can be
this
judged
IPC
solely
number,
by the eye.
just this IPC number 479 of IPC, no, Indian Penal Code.
Yeah,
So now I think it must be changed.
yeah, and nobody, including lawyers, has any idea what it's become. Now we have to wait for the
Where it has
final.
gone. Okay.
Not really. Yeah, yeah. But whatever it is, hopefully this is covered there. But anyway, yeah. So the last point is on the exceptions. It's not very important, but these are the four things that you need to remember. So once you separate the functional aspects, what remains is either a feature of shape, configuration, pattern, ornament, or lines or color, which are applied either in 2D or 3D form by means of mass production or an industrial process, which, when applied to a finished article, are truly to be solely judged by its appeal to your eyes, right? It has to look good, essentially. That is what design law protects. Now, see, there are two ways of understanding how to prosecute effectively an intellectual property application, right? So now we have done four things. We have done copyright, we have done trademarks, we have done patents, and we have done designs. In all of these cases, you have to make an application to the registrar, to the relevant registrar of the intellectual property office to acquire a registration to be the sole person doing something, right? Now, there are two ways to look at this. One is I can take you to the website and really just go through the entire procedure with you. But I believe everyone who is participating in this is smart enough to figure that out on your own, because you just have to go to the website and really see what the exact procedure is. What I will address are the three most important aspects that you have to get right in a design application for you to succeed before the IP office, right? So, any design application, apart from all the procedural rigors that the law includes, has to have these three aspects. The first of which you're seeing on the slide right now. The first one is representation. So the representation is of a design is really important, because what design law protects is what you can see, right? So the visual representation that you show to the IP office is all that will be protected, right? So since this visual representation really defines the monopoly that you are getting under the law, the representation, every design application has something called a representation sheet. On this representation sheet, you have to show all the views of your design. So you have to show a front, like an elevation view, you have to show a side view, you have to show a profile view, and you have to show your product in all angles and how it looks to truly capture the entire sense of the monopoly that you're getting, right? And in a very famous case of Ford, they made a design application to the Designs Authority in Britain, and had shown only the front view, like on the left side, you're able to see the image, right? They'd shown only one such view of the tire, the car wheel that they manufactured, and the application got rejected only because it hadn't truly visually captured the entirety of the design. So, the first thing that you need to remember and you have to get from a client when you start doing a design application is visual representations of the designs that are adequately clear from all angles. So, all your 2D images should together encapsulate the entire three-dimensional representation of the design. Is that clear?
Yeah.
So without this, nothing will go forward. Your application will just get rejected. So you have to
Rejected.
get this representation sheet absolutely correctly, right? Okay. Then the next one is statement of novelty, right? So just to make life simpler, I have pulled out these examples that you're seeing on the screen from the manual for design protection provided by the IP office in India itself. So essentially, every design that you try to protect, just like in patents, has to be novel, which means it should be a step above what already exists in the market, right? You have to explain what about your design is new and not already similar to something that exists in the market. Because by now you would have understood this pattern. Intellectual property law protects something only when it is new. The standards of how new it should be will vary from copyright to patent to trademark to design. However, every design has to be novel, right? So, every design application has to be accompanied by what we call a novelty statement. The novelty statements are illustrated here. Okay. So it should have a statement that says novelty resides in the shape of the ashtray. So let's say I come up with an ashtray that is shaped like a football for selling during, I don't know, FIFA season or something. So I have to really restrict my novelty statements to what I believe is novel. So if I say the novelty resides in the shape of the ashtray having a rectangular slot to hold a half finished cigarette, that cannot be novel because every ashtray has that slot for you to put a cigarette, right? I'm sorry, not your cigarette. I don't know
Yeah.
if you smoke, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
rectangular slot is there in every ashtray. That is not new. So that cannot be amenable to design protection. But if I say that the novelty resides in really the football shape of an ashtray, then I've made the right novelty statement because that is what is truly novel about my design, right? Similarly, the novelty resides in the shape or configuration of the bookshelf as illustrated, which can be like a combination of wood panes or glass or whatever, right? Or you can see on the left, there are three teapots of which I've shown you visual representations. All of these three are really design registered, okay, in various countries. So each of them is a teapot. Each of them functions like a teapot. All the use of each of these products is the same. However, visually they are very different from each other, right? So the one on the right top has like an embossed, like a sculptural three-dimensional design of flowers. The same floral design on the left one is different from that on at the right bottom. So all of these three are amenable to design protection. However, you have to make the novelty statement correctly. The novelty statement should only capture what is novel to your design. Right? So if it's got something to do with the shape, then you would put in a novelty statement that is like the third example. The novelty resides in the groove and projection as illustrated. So any product may have, let's say, a water bottle. It has a groove, it has grooves and it has projections. Your novelty statement will literally say the novelty resides in groove and projection as illustrated, right? Or the novelty resides in the ornamental surface pattern of the football as illustrated. So these are all novelty statements, and they have to be restricted to what is truly novel in your product. So just to recap, the first important thing is getting the representation sheet right, right? So you have to represent visually the product from all angles so as to truly encapsulate this entire three-dimensional product that you have created. The second is the statement of novelty should be specific and restricted truly only to what is novel to your design. Then the third most important thing that you need to remember is the article to which it applies. So, going back to the teapot example, see the last one, novelty is claimed for the floral ornamentation of teapot as illustrated. This is a good novelty statement, right? Because it is explaining what the novelty applies to and what product it applies to also. So, I can't come up with a floral ornamentation design and not specify which product it applies to. So I can't simply say novelty is claimed for floral ornamentation and just draw some flowers on a piece of paper and throw it at the officer to register. That cannot be registered. Every design that you come up with has to be applicable to a specific product. You can't come up with a vague ephemeral design and then say that, I can apply to 10 different products or 20 different products and unnecessarily claw your way into monopolistic regions like that, right? Your monopoly has to be restricted to one particular design that you apply to one particular product. And that has to be specific. So that's where the third requirement comes, right? Mention the article to which it applies, right? So the first line that you see on the slide is how article is defined in the Designs Act. Section 2 of the Designs Act defines it as any article of manufacture and any substance, artificial or partly artificial and partly natural, and includes any part of any article capable of being made and sold separately. So that being made and sold separately is the operative part. So a water bottle or a teapot or a lamp or a curtain or a bedspread or a sari, these are all products that are capable of being made and sold separately, right? So your design should be a visual ornamentation that applies to an article that can be made and sold separately, right? So what are they doing here? They are separating the ornamentation from the product itself. So your monopoly doesn't extend to a teapot. A teapot already exists. So the functional aspects of the teapot, like the handle and the spout and the lid, all of this you cannot extend your monopoly to. What you can extend your monopoly to is the ornamentation that you will apply eventually to an article that is made and sold separately. Is that clear? So in this, there is one case that will really help you understand what they mean by article. So in this Littlewood Pools, so Littlewood Pools is a very famous football pool organization. They used to organize football pools. You know what pools are, right? Basically like Dream11 and stuff, where they bet on a team and then they win money on that basis. So this is very old. This is, as you can see, it was happening in the 1940s. So back then, obviously, there were no apps and stuff to do this. So there were pieces of paper on which you could, you had to make your bets and place your bets and stuff. And they had come up with some unique piece of paper, like a paper on which it's explained there, a rectangular sheet of paper on which a pattern was formed by straight lines. The spaces between were filled with literary matter. So this particular design was what was prosecuted in this case. In this case, the court held that the paper was not an article and stated that the paper was not an article on which the design had to be, embedded. The paper really had no function of its own, right? So the sole function of that paper was to carry that design itself. So the paper was not an article that was capable of being made and sold separately. An article that is capable of being made and sold separately is, like I said, a water bottle or a teapot. Like these articles can exist on their own. Your design coming on that article just makes the article better looking, right? But in this case, the paper was an essential part of the design itself. Without the paper, the design wouldn't exist. So it's not like the paper is made and sold separately and this design was being printed on it as some ornamental feature, right? In this case, like for instance, if there is a piece of paper with a crossword puzzle on it, the paper is not an article that is capable of being made and sold separately. The crossword wouldn't exist without the paper, right? Because the crossword needs a surface to be on. So this is another separation that design makes. So the article should already be in existence, right? So we will just end with this flow chart on the procedure for design registration. I'm sure you're already aware of the procedure for copyright, trademark, and patent registration. So this is very, very similar. So I won't be going very, in detail into every step. But essentially, once when you're filing your application, you need to remember three things. One is it has to be the representation sheet has to be correct. Second, your statement of novelty has to be correct, like we just saw earlier. And third, you have to explain the useful article to which your design applies. After that, the application will be examined. Once it is examined, obviously, if there is no objection, it will get accepted. But among the three things that I mentioned, even if one of the things is wrong, they'll communicate the objection to you. You have to comply with those objections. And upon satisfactory compliance with those objections, only then they will accept, and then they will notify it in a journal. Once it is notified in the journal, it's open for a few months for third parties to see the journal and object and say that, this design is similar to mine and you can't register it. In the event there are no oppositions to your design, it will eventually get certified as a registered design. Once it is registered, it is valid for the first period of 10 years, after which you have to file a renewal application. Once it is renewed, it's valid for an additional period of 15 years, after which the design registration expires and your design will enter the public domain. Okay. So we can stop here. I've covered pretty much everything that I wanted to address. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Otherwise, the assignment will be communicated to you. Please complete it and send it across to us.
So we also have a few participants who have joined in probably a little later. Like we have Mayank, and then we have Venkat and Ravindranath. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, madam.
A quick round of introduction from your side would be great. So could you just introduce yourselves very quickly?
I am Ravindranath, sir. I am enrolled for MA Corporate Law from Valsad.
Mayank, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, ma'am. Good morning. Ma'am, I am a corporate lawyer practicing in Indore, Madhya Pradesh. And basically, my practice area is NCLT and IPR laws and DRT matters.
Okay, excellent. Thank you and welcome to the session. Of course, we are almost getting to the fag end of the session, but we also would like to inform you. We will, of course, keep you posted also of the subsequent sessions that will come up in the month of February. Please do join us. And any questions here in this part of the presentation, in this session, please feel free to ask your questions.
I don't know when you all joined, but I wasn't able to see actually who got added to the session later. But if you have any questions, you can ask me now. In any case, I think there is a recording of this that will be available, which you can watch at your own pace and email us your questions if you have any.
So I guess it's pretty much clear in terms of, and of course, the most important takeaway out of this particular discussion has been the distinction between the utility part and the aesthetic part, which I guess that's where the US laws has made it quite easier for them, where you have a utility patent and
exactly. So they sort of understand but also the US, as we all know, is very aggressive with giving monopolies away like this, right? Because most monopolies are available there only for grabs. So what happens in the US is even their standard for patenting is much lower. That's why many softwares and all of that are patentable in the US, which are not in India. In India, we have a very high standard for patent, and we try not to cover functional aspects only so that they're freely available without being expensive in the market. And sort of we have taken leaves out of the books of European countries mostly and common law, which is English law, and we haven't really gone on what the US has been doing. And generally also, if you sort of track the development of these laws, the US has been doing its own thing very consistently, and the rest of the world has been together on most of these things. Although now, TRIPS and Berne Convention and all of them have sort of standardized how these laws operate. Yeah, still, as Pratima pointed out, a higher degree of protection is available in the US, which is not available in India. So design laws as they stand in India are because of the fact that they restrict themselves to aesthetics, sort of closer to copyright law in that sense, and patents don't even come close to this. On the other hand, if you come up with something that is useful and functional and meets the standard of inventiveness, then you have to apply for a patent only for the functional aspects.
Yeah. So, and in today's context, would these graphical user interface GUIs also fall within the ambit of design protection, Sheetal?
It would.
A lot-
Actually, if you just do a search on the designs, WIPO design search, the international design search, you'll see that a lot of user interfaces are have been registered across the world, and minimally so in India. That's possibly also because our office doesn't have such a great technical understanding of how it really works. We are a little behind on that, but if you see, there will be a lot of US and Canadian registrations of tactile sort of user interfaces that are available. Which is, I mean, it's a good question because honestly, a lot of design development efforts in terms of even the amount of money and time they invest is going towards making an app look better, right? And this is so quantitatively discernible because if you've been an Android user for a very long time, it happened to me recently, and if you suddenly switch to an iPhone, you will be completely lost. Like all your muscle memory for your phone becomes useless. You can't even you become slower. It's difficult for you to understand how the drag and drop functions work. That's how important UI is, because from everyday use of these products, you're sort of building even a muscle memory around it. And designers put so much thought into all of this. This is so problematic to a point where I had to dump my iPhone and I switched back to Android because the phone made me slower. That's how much design development really goes into these things. So yes, definitely user interfaces are a part of this debate. The extent to which it is registrable and the form in which it is registrable is all debatable, because the way I was just explaining, right, about the three most important things in a design application. So if you had to do really a proper representation of uh, a user interface in the representation sheet that you will file in a design application, how would you do it? There's no real way to capture every aspect, every visual aspect of UI.
Right.
So these are all things in which the law and the procedural aspects that have come out of the law are still lagging behind. Like we've still not caught up with how much design thinking has developed over the years. And if there is, I mean, without I mean, throughout the session, I didn't go into my opinions about various things. But if you ask me, this is probably one of the most backward aspects of intellectual property law design. Especially Indian intellectual property law, where we've just not coped with how design works. That raises other questions, of course, like do all designs really have to be protected at all? Maybe not, but we are not even thinking about it. That's where the problem comes.
Okay. Any recent judgments on the design protection aspects which you would like us to read? I mean, something which you really think is very important or something was landmark?
Yeah, I can share them with you. There are a lot of judgments from the Delhi High Court on these aspects of functionality, and I told you about the arbitrary rule, right? Like once something gets manufactured in numbers more than 50, it loses the ability to be protected under copyright law. So the constitutional validity of that provision was challenged. So that's a good judgment to read also, to really understand where these requirements of functionality and all of these things are coming from. So I'll share those with you as well.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so that's it from us for now. And participants, please write to us just in case you have any queries, any further points for discussion. Please do write to us. We will help you touch base with the instructors to clarify anything that you want. And we look forward to see you all during the February sessions, and some really interesting and very important and relevant aspects of IPR coming up in the month of February, like contract drafting in the context of intellectual property rights. And then we have a few sessions on intellectual property management, IP enforcement, some sector-specific intellectual property rights. So we would look forward to have you all during the next couple of sessions that's happening during February. We will keep you posted on the dates of the subsequent
Okay.
sessions. Please do join us.
Sure. Okay.
I think we also have another participant who just joined in, but then the session is almost coming to a close. Hello, Indu.
Hi, ma'am. Actually, this is Sandeep. I just joined in from
Hello,
your
sir. Hello. Yeah, we're so sorry. We're just closing the session, but please introduce yourself, Sandeep.
Sure, ma'am. So, hi everyone. My name is Sandeep Aditya, and sorry for joining in late. I actually missed this mail. I had a horrible work day yesterday, so I thought I would sleep in a bit more. So, I'm from Hyderabad, and most of you, I joined this course to get my advanced 1 year diploma in corporate law. I'm currently working as an accounting analyst at Optum Global Solutions. I got my UG from Loyola Academy, Hyderabad. I did my UG in BCom honors, and currently I'm also pursuing to join my MBA. I just gave my CAT exam and all. So yeah, that's about me, and really glad to meet you all and to meet you too, ma'am.
Pleasure. Sandeep, we will also keep you posted on the subsequent sessions during February. Please do join us. There are some really, really interesting sessions on IPR. And if you would like to also know a little bit more about the AIPR program, you can just touch base with any of us. I have just posted one of the email address here on chat. You could make a note of it. That's Anshul Dua at ebcpublishing.in. So any of you would like to reach out to us regarding the AIPR course, or if you want to know something more about what is being offered as the complete course. This is just an audit course that you're all attending, but if you would like to know more, if you have missed out some of the previous really interesting sessions, please reach out to us. We will help you out with it. Our instructor Sheetal's email address, as well as the contact numbers out on the chat here. So you can just make a note of it, and please feel free to reach out to her for questions or clarifications. And for those of you who joined in late, Sheetal is an advocate and she is an IPR expert. She has been practicing. She's been practicing in the high courts in Hyderabad, if I'm right, Sheetal.
Yeah, right now Hyderabad, but I've been in Chennai and Bangalore.
Chennai, Bangalore, and Hyderabad. So these are her practice areas. And so please feel free to reach out to her. She has been our instructor at the with the AIPR course at EBC Learning. So please feel free to reach out to us.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. With this, we end this session. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Have a good.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
good Monday.